A grieving widow, a flaunting mistress, a funeral that becomes a battlefield. For Catherine Davies, her husband Richard's death was supposed to be an ending, a quiet release from a gilded cage. But when his mistress Scarlett Vance laughed in her face beside the open grave, it became a declaration of war. Everyone in the packed church, the titans of industry, and the whispers of high society thought they knew how this story would end, with the younger, bolder woman inheriting everything. They were all wrong. The real battle wasn't for a dead man's heart, but for his secrets, and the only person holding the key was a quiet lawyer about to read the last will and testament. The scent of white lilies was suffocating. It clung to the heavy, damp air inside Blackwood Chapel, a thick, cloying perfume that promised reverence but delivered only a headache. Catherine Davies stood in the front pew, a statue carved from grief and black wool. Her veil, a delicate web of lace, did little to obscure the sharp, dignified lines of her face, but it offered a fragile barrier between her and the prying eyes of the mourners. They had come in droves to see the spectacle, the public farewell to Richard Davies, real estate magnate, philanthropic darling, and as everyone silently acknowledged, a man of cavernous secrets. Catherine felt their gazes like tiny pinpricks on her skin. They weren't looks of sympathy. They were looks of assessment, of ravenous curiosity. How was she holding up? Would she break? And the question that hung unspoken in the incense-laden air, where was she? As if on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open, letting in a slice of watery gray afternoon light. A collective subtle intake of breath rippled through the pews. There, silhouetted against the day, was Scarlett Vance. She was not dressed for mourning. She was dressed for a premiere, a tight, exquisitely tailored black dress that hugged every curve, a wide-brimmed hat tilted at a dramatic angle, and heels that clicked with defiant authority on the ancient stone floor. Her face, a masterpiece of cosmetic artistry, was streaked with perfectly theatrical tears that never dared to smudge her mascara. She wasn't just a mistress. She was an announcement, a walking, breathing scandal. Ignoring the usher's hesitant gesture towards a seat in the back, Scarlett glided down the central aisle, her progress a slow, deliberate performance. Whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves. The audacity! Richard would have loved this. Look at Catherine. She's frozen. Catherine didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany casket at the altar, on the profusion of lilies that seemed to be breeding in the gloom. She could feel Scarlett's approach, a change in the atmospheric pressure. Then a waft of expensive, aggressive perfume, Jardin d'Amour, Richard's favorite, on her, cut through the funereal scent of the flowers. Scarlett stopped, not beside Catherine, but slightly in front of her, positioning herself just enough to block Catherine's view of the casket. She placed a single blood-red rose on the polished wood, her long crimson nails a stark contrast to the somber setting. Then she turned. Her eyes, a piercing shade of blue, met Catherine's through the veil. There was no sympathy there, no shared grief. There was only triumph. "He loved me, you know." Scarlett whispered, her voice a low, throaty purr, just loud enough for the front pews to hear. "He was mine, this whole thing," she gestured dismissively at the solemn assembly. "It's just a formality. His life was with me." Catherine remained silent. Her hands clasped in front of her were steady. She had spent 2 decades married to Richard Davies. She had learned the art of stillness, of weathering storms, by becoming the stone they broke against. She had survived his moods, his ambitions, his chilling emotional distance. She would survive this. The service began a drone of platitudes and carefully curated memories. The priest spoke of Richard's generosity, his vision for the city, his contributions to the arts, the public Richard, the one chiseled onto building plaques. David Chen, Richard's long-suffering business partner, gave a stilted eulogy, his eyes carefully avoiding both Catherine and Scarlett. He spoke of contracts and foundations of a legacy of steel and glass, never once touching on the man himself. Through it all, Scarlett sobbed. They were loud, gulping sobs that shook her perfect shoulders. She dabbed at her eyes with a black silk handkerchief, a damsel in deep distress. The mourners were captivated. Some looked on in disgust, others with a kind of grudging admiration for her sheer nerve. The true moment of ignition came at the cemetery. The sky wept a miserable drizzle as the casket was lowered into the earth. As the first handful of soil was tossed by the priest, Scarlett stepped forward, her composure finally shattering into something jagged and ugly. "No!" she cried out, lunging toward the grave. "You can't leave me, Ricky! You promised!" Two of Richard's cousins, looking deeply uncomfortable, moved to restrain her. She thrashed in their arms, a wild, beautiful thing consumed by a very public grief. And then she looked directly at Catherine, who stood beside the grave, her face still an impassive mask. A strange, chilling sound escaped Scarlett's lips. It started as a sob, then twisted, contorting into something else entirely. It was a laugh, a raw, hysterical laugh that was part grief, part madness, and part pure, unadulterated victory. "You think you've won!" Scarlett shrieked, her voice echoing across the manicured lawns of the cemetery. "You think this little piece of paper, this marriage, means anything? He's gone. But he left everything that mattered to me, the penthouse, the company, the future. You're just the widow. I was his life." The laughter continued, sharp and brittle, as the cousins finally managed to lead her away. It scraped against the funereal silence, a sound so obscene that people flinched. They looked at Catherine, expecting her to crumble, to scream, to finally show a crack in her porcelain facade. But Catherine Davies simply reached out her gloved hand steady and accepted a white lily from the floral arrangement. She held it for a moment, her gaze fixed on the dark, rectangular hole in the ground that had just swallowed the last 20 years of her life. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to cry. The performance was over. The real story was about to begin, and it wouldn't be told in a church or a cemetery, but in the sterile, wood-paneled office of a lawyer named Alastair Finch. And in that room there would be no room for performance, only for the truth. The house was silent. It was a cavernous, oppressive silence that was entirely new. For 20 years, the sprawling estate in Greenwich had been filled with the noise of Richard's existence, his booming voice on the phone, the heavy tread of his expensive shoes on the marble floors, the low hum of the television always tuned to a financial news network. Now the silence was a presence in itself, amplifying the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, the whisper of the wind against the leaded glass windows. Catherine walked through the grand hall, her hand trailing along the cold, polished surface of a mahogany console table. On it sat a collection of framed photographs. Richard with a former president. Richard cutting a ribbon at a hospital wing bearing his name. Richard and Catherine on their wedding day, two strangers smiling for the camera, he with a look of possession, she with a look of hopeful terror. There were no photos of Richard and Scarlett. Richard was a master of compartmentalization. His public life was pristine. She entered his study, the heart of his empire within their home. It smelled of him, leather-expensive scotch, and the faint metallic scent of ambition. Nothing had been touched since he'd left that final morning. A crystal glass with a film of amber liquid sat on his massive oak desk. A stack of papers, the Argus Tower deal, was held down by a heavy brass paperweight shaped like a bull. Catherine had always hated that bull. It was a perfect brutish symbol of how he'd conducted his life. She sank into his deep leather chair, the seat still holding the faint impression of his form. It felt like sitting in a ghost's lap. It was here in this room that their marriage had truly died, not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet cuts. She remembered the early years. She had been a promising art historian working at a small but respected gallery. He had been a cyclone of charisma and power sweeping into her life, promising her the world. She had been dazzled not by the money, but by the sheer force of his will. He seemed like a man who could bend reality to his liking. She had mistaken that power for strength. The change was gradual. At first, it was subtle suggestions. "That gallery job is a nice hobby, Kate, but you don't need it. Your place is with me." Then came the isolation. "These old college friends of yours, they're so pedestrian. They don't understand our world." He built this magnificent house for her, a palace of polished surfaces and empty rooms, and then locked the gates. It wasn't a home, it was a display case. She was his most beautiful, most placid acquisition. Her own passions were dismissed. When she tried to set up a small studio in a spare room, he'd surprised her by having it converted into a state-of-the-art gym he never used. "Art is for looking at darling, not for making a mess," he'd said with a patronizing smile. The suspicions of infidelity had started a decade ago, a lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his suit jacket. Late-night business meetings that stretched until dawn. A credit card bill with a charge for a jeweler she had never visited. When she confronted him, he deployed his most potent weapon, gaslighting. "You're being hysterical, Catherine. Are you unwell? Perhaps you should talk to someone." He would say, his voice a calm, chilling balm of condescension. He made her feel as if her own intuition was a form of madness. He would spin tales of business pressures and demanding clients so elaborate, so detailed, that she would begin to doubt her own senses. For a time, she believed him, or more accurately, she chose to. To accept the truth would have meant dismantling the entire artifice of her life, and she hadn't had the strength. Then came Scarlett, about 5 years ago. This one was different. She wasn't a secret, she was a statement. He flaunted her at restaurants just outside their usual social circuit. He bought her a penthouse apartment on the other side of town, an open secret whispered about at cocktail parties Catherine was forced to attend. Scarlett wasn't just an affair. She was a parallel life, a second, more vibrant narrative running alongside his staid, respectable marriage. Why had she stayed? Olivia, her one remaining friend from her old life, had asked her that question 100 times. "Leave him, Kate. You have your own trust fund from your parents. It's not enormous, but it's enough. You can start over." But it wasn't that simple. Catherine would look at Richard, at the empire he had built, and see the scared, ambitious boy he had once been, the one she'd caught glimpses of in their first year together. A part of her pitied him. Another part was terrified of him. He had woven their finances, their social standing, their entire lives into a tapestry so complex that pulling a single thread felt like it would unravel everything. He had once told her during a particularly cold argument, "You'll never leave me, Catherine, because you are in every legal and practical sense me. Without me, you are nothing." He had meant it as a threat. But sitting there in the deafening silence of his empty study, she realized it might also be a clue. She stood up, and walked to the towering bookshelf that covered one entire wall. It was filled with leather-bound classics he had never read, and biographies of great men he admired. But behind a row of matching encyclopedias, she knew was a safe. She had seen him used it only a handful of times, always with a furtive, secretive air. She had never known the combination. It didn't matter now. Whatever was in there was part of his estate, and Alistair Finch would have it opened. Her fingers brushed against a small, framed photo tucked away on a lower shelf, almost hidden. It was from a holiday in Italy, early in their marriage. They were on a balcony overlooking Lake Como. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her face unguarded, and genuinely happy. He was looking at her, not the camera, and for a fleeting moment the man in the photograph wasn't a magnate or a monster. He was just a husband. A single hot tear finally escaped, tracing a path down her cold cheek. It wasn't a tear for the man who had died, the cruel architect of her gilded cage. It was a tear for the woman in the photograph, the one who had believed in him. It was a tear for the life that had been stolen from her, not by Scarlett, but by the man they were both now fighting over. She straightened her back, wiping the tear away with a resolute swipe of her finger. The grief was real, but it was for herself. Richard had made his choices. He had lived his life and his second life with unapologetic selfishness. Now, he was gone. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence in the house didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a possibility. It felt like the clean, quiet air before a storm, yes, but also the stillness before a brand new day. The offices of Finch, Abernathy, and Cole were the physical embodiment of old money and discretion. Located in a pre-war building overlooking Central Park, the space was a hushed sanctuary of polished mahogany-worn Persian rugs and the faint, pleasant scent of aging paper and lemon oil. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of the secrets it had absorbed over the decades. Catherine arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by her friend Olivia, who had insisted on being there for moral support. Catherine wore a simple navy blue dress, her only adornment the thin gold wedding band she still hadn't brought herself to remove. She was the picture of quiet composure, a stark contrast to the scene they walked into. Scarlett Vance was already there holding court in the center of the waiting room. She was dressed in a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit, a deliberate and defiant rejection of traditional mourning attire. She was flanked by a slick young lawyer who looked more like a shark than a man of jurisprudence. Scarlett was speaking in a loud, confident voice to Richard's mother, Margaret Davies, a woman who looked as if she'd been chiseled from a block of granite. "Margaret, darling, you must come and see what I've done with the penthouse," Scarlett was saying, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Ricky always said the decor was a bit too, well, stuffy. I've brought in a designer from Milan. It's much more us." Margaret Davies, a formidable matriarch whose approval Richard had chased his entire life, looked down her nose at Scarlett with undisguised disdain. "My son," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "had many appetites. I am not required to find all of them tasteful." Scarlett's smile faltered for a microsecond before she recovered. "Oh, Margaret, always so droll. You'll come around once you see how happy he was with me." Just then, David Chen, Richard's business partner, arrived. He was a meticulous man. His suit perfectly pressed his face a neutral mask. He nodded curtly at Margaret and Scarlett, his eyes flicking briefly to Catherine with a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. He took a seat as far away from the two women as possible, opening his briefcase and pretending to study a document. The tension in the room was thick enough to be a physical presence. It was a clashing of worlds. The old established world of Margaret and Catherine, built on tradition and propriety, and the new flashy world of Scarlet, built on ambition and audacity. At precisely 10:15, the door to the inner office opened. A tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and piercing gray eyes emerged. This was Alistair Finch. He had been the Davies family lawyer for 40 years, having first worked for Richard's father. He exuded an aura of unshakable calm and authority. "Good morning," he said, his voice dry as parchment. "If you would all please come in." He led them into a large, book-lined conference room. A massive polished table dominated the space, reflecting the grim faces of the assembly. Finch took his seat at the head of the table, placing a thick, leather-bound folder before him. He gestured for the others to sit. Catherine and Olivia sat on one side of the table. Margaret Davies sat on the other, her back ramrod straight. David Chen sat beside her, looking deeply uncomfortable. Scarlet, with a theatrical flourish, pulled out the chair directly opposite Catherine, her young lawyer taking the seat next to her. She leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table, a predatory gleam in her eyes. It was a clear, unspoken challenge. Finch put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses and cleared his throat. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silent room. "We are gathered here today," he began, his tone formal and devoid of emotion, "for the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Harold Davies, executed on the 5th of January 2024. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over each person at the table. "I must advise you that the contents are as per Mr. Davies's instructions to be considered final and legally binding. Any emotional outbursts will not alter the facts laid out in this document, and I will ask anyone who cannot maintain their composure to leave." His eyes rested on Scarlet for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else. Scarlet simply smirked a small, confident smile that said she had nothing to fear. She subtly adjusted the massive diamond ring on her left hand, a ring Catherine knew for a fact was not from Richard's usual jeweler. She was the picture of smug certainty, the cat who had not only gotten the cream, but also owned the dairy. Catherine felt Olivia's hand gently squeeze her arm under the table. She took a slow, deep breath. She looked at the faces around her. Margaret, a mother who had lost her son, but seemed more concerned with the family's reputation. David, a partner who was likely worried about the future of the company he had helped build. And Scarlet, a woman so convinced of her own narrative that she couldn't imagine any other reality. And then there was Catherine, the wife, the relic, the woman everyone assumed was about to be publicly humiliated and cast aside. She looked at Alistair Finch, at his impassive, lawyerly face. He held the story of Richard's life and death in his hands. Whatever was in that folder, it would be the truth. Or at least it would be Richard's final version of it. For the first time since that horrible phone call from the hospital, Catherine didn't feel dread. She felt a strange, detached curiosity. She was no longer a participant in Richard's drama. She was an observer waiting for the final act to unfold. The storm had gathered. Now, it was about to break. Alistair Finch adjusted his glasses, the slight movement seeming to command the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He untied the silk ribbon around the thick document and opened it. The crisp crackle of the heavy paper was the only sound. "I, Richard Harold Davies." Finch began reading, his voice a steady, dispassionate monotone. "Being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all former wills and codicils." He continued through the standard legal preamble, the words washing over the room in a dull wave. Catherine focused on a point on the polished table, tracing the wood grain with her eyes, bracing herself. Across from her, Scarlett was practically vibrating with anticipation, her smirk fixed in place. Her lawyer whispered something to her, and she nodded, her confidence radiating like heat. First, Finch read, "I direct my executor to pay all my just debts' funeral expenses and the costs of the administration of my estate." He paused, taking a sip of water from a glass that had been placed before him. The pause felt deliberate, a small piece of theater. "Second, to my beloved mother, Margaret Eleanor Davies, I bequeath the sum of $1 million to be paid from my personal accounts, along with my collection of antique clocks, in gratitude for her lifelong guidance." Margaret's expression did not change. It was a substantial sum, but likely less than she had expected. She gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a business transaction had been completed to a satisfactory, if underwhelming, degree. "Third, to my loyal friend and business partner, David Chen. I bequeath my complete share of ownership in our jointly held consulting firm, Chen Davies Analytics, as well as a personal gift of $500,000 in recognition of his tireless work and dedication, without which our primary ventures would not have been possible." David Chen looked genuinely surprised. He blinked several times, his professional mask slipping to reveal a flicker of emotion. He had clearly expected to have to negotiate the buyout of Richard's shares. He looked over at Catherine and gave a small, almost apologetic nod. He had been a beneficiary of Richard's planning. Finch turned a page. Catherine's heart began to beat a little faster. This was it. The main bequests were next. The properties, the stocks, the core of the fortune. Scarlett leaned forward even further, her blue eyes gleaming. Her lawyer gave her a confident pat on the arm. This was their moment. "Fourth," Finch announced, his voice steady, "to Ms. Scarlett Vance." He paused again, looking directly at Scarlett over the top of his glasses. The room held its breath. "To Ms. Scarlett Vance," he repeated, "I bequeath the property located at 1400 Park Avenue, Penthouse B, with all of its contents, furnishings, and art, to be hers completely and without encumbrance from my estate." A triumphant, audible sigh escaped Scarlett's lips. Her lawyer beamed. This was it. The multi-million-dollar penthouse, the symbol of their life together. It was hers. She shot a venomous, victorious look at Catherine. See, her eyes screamed. "I told you. I was his life." But Finch hadn't finished. He was still reading. "I also bequeath to Ms. Vance the 2023 Bentley Continental GT currently registered in my name and housed in the Park Avenue garage, and the contents of the savings account ending in the numbers 4758 at the First National Bank of New York, which as of the date of this will contains approximately $250,000. It was a staggering gift. The penthouse alone was worth over $10 million. The car, another $250,000. Plus the cash. Scarlett's victory was complete. She sat back in her chair, a queen surveying her conquered territory. She looked almost bored now, as if the rest of the reading was a mere formality. Olivia's hand found Catherine's again under the table, giving it a comforting squeeze. Catherine braced herself for what was to come next, the pittance, the charitable trust in her name, the polite but firm financial dismissal that would finalize her public humiliation. Finch turned another page. His expression remained utterly unreadable. "Fifth," he said, and the room, which had relaxed slightly after Scarlett's bequest, grew tense again. "Regarding my wife, Catherine Marie Davies." Scarlett let out a tiny, almost inaudible scoff. She began examining her perfectly manicured nails, feigning disinterest. "To my wife, Catherine," Finch read, "I bequeath our primary residence at 212 Overlook Lane, Greenwich, Connecticut, with all its contents and the adjacent 20 acres of land." It was expected. The house was legally half hers anyway. It was the cage Richard had built for her, and now it was hers to keep. It felt less like a gift, and more like a life sentence. "I also bequeath to her my art collection housed at the Greenwich residence, with the exception of the Warhol, which is to be sold, with proceeds going to the estate." He continued, "She is to receive a lifetime stipend of $100,000 per year to be managed and dispersed by a trust administered by my executor." $100,000 a year. It sounded like a lot of money to most people, but in the world she inhabited, it was an insult. It was enough to maintain the house, but not the lifestyle. It was enough to keep her comfortable, but powerless. It was a golden leash, Richard's final act of control from beyond the grave. Scarlett didn't even bother to hide her smile now. She had the penthouse, the car, the cash, the glamorous city life. Catherine was left with an empty mansion in the suburbs and an allowance. The battle was over. The Mistress had won. "Finally," Finch said, looking up from the document, "the remainder of my estate, including all stocks, bonds, investment portfolios, commercial properties, and controlling shares in Davies Holdings International, shall be placed into the Richard H. Davies Charitable Foundation to be overseen by a board of directors. The founding members of this board will be my mother, Margaret Davies, my partner, David Chen, and—" Finch paused. "Ms. Scarlett Vance." The blood drained from David Chen's face. Margaret Davies looked apoplectic, her mouth a thin, hard line. Scarlett, however, looked as though she had just been crowned. Not only had she received the personal gifts, but she was now in control of the entire business empire alongside the Dragon Lady Mother and the stooge partner. She held all the cards. Her gaze fell upon Catherine, and the triumphant smirk blossomed into a full, radiant smile of pure, malevolent joy. It was a look that said everything she had screamed at the funeral. "You are nothing. He was mine. It's all mine." The testament had been read. The story, it seemed, was over. A thick, stunned silence filled the conference room. Margaret Davies looked as if she'd swallowed acid. David Chen was pale, staring at Alistair Finch as if the lawyer had just announced the sky was turning green. Scarlett, in contrast, was glowing. She was subtly texting on her phone under the table, likely announcing her victory to the world. "Well," Scarlett said, breaking the silence as she placed her phone face down with a decisive click, "I must say Ricky always was a generous man. I'll be sure to run the foundation just as he would have wanted, aggressively." Her lawyer began packing his briefcase, the snap of the latches echoing like gunshots. "If there is nothing further, Mr. Finch, my client has a great deal to attend to." "Please remain seated," Finch said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. The lawyer froze his hands, hovering over his briefcase. Scarlett's triumphant expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "The reading of the primary will is complete." Finch continued, looking at them all over his glasses. "However, there are some administrative matters tied to the bequests that require immediate clarification." He slid a thin folder across the table towards Scarlett's lawyer. "This pertains to the Park Avenue property. It is, as stated, bequeathed to Ms. Vance. However, the property carries a significant mortgage which Mr. Davies took out against it 8 months ago. The outstanding principal is approximately $7.2 million. As the new owner, Ms. Vance is now, of course, responsible for that debt. The color drained from Scarlett's face. What, that's impossible. Ricky owned that place outright. He told me he did. Mr. Davies was creative with his finances, Finch said dryly. The bank holds the lien. The documents are all in order. And Scarlett's lawyer quickly opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. His confident demeanor evaporated, replaced by a look of growing horror. He leaned over and whispered frantically in Scarlett's ear. "$7 million?" She squawked, her voice suddenly shrill. "But the apartment is only worth 10, and the maintenance fees are over $20,000 a month. I can't afford that." "That is a matter for you and the bank to discuss," Finch replied coolly. He then turned to David Chen. "David, regarding the company Davies Holdings. You, Ms. Vance, and Mrs. Davies are indeed the board of the foundation which will inherit it. But you should be aware that the company is currently leveraged to an extraordinary degree. Richard funded his last 3 acquisitions with high-interest, short-term loans. The company's liquid assets are negligible. In fact," he paused, consulting a sheet of paper. "Davies Holdings is facing a debt service payment of $15 million due in 90 days. Failure to meet that payment will result in the forfeiture of the company's primary assets to its creditors." David Chen slumped in his chair, running a hand over his face. $15 million. We don't have that. We were counting on the Argus Tower deal too. The Argus Tower deal collapsed the morning Mr. Davies died, Finch stated flatly. The investors pulled out. That I am given to understand is what precipitated his cardiac event. The empire was a house of cards. Richard hadn't been a king sitting on a throne of gold. He'd been a gambler on a losing streak, pushing all his chips into the center of the table for one last, desperate hand. And he had lost. Scarlett was staring at Finch, her mouth slightly agape, the triumphant queen suddenly looking like a peasant who'd been handed a bill for the crown jewels. The penthouse was a trap. The company was a sinking ship. The beautiful, glamorous life he had promised her was an illusion, a stage set that was now being dismantled around her. "What about the cash?" she stammered, pointing a trembling, crimson-nailed finger at the will. "The bank account, the $250,000... Finch adjusted his glasses. "Ah, yes. That account is solvent. However, Mr. Davies also had a number of personal credit lines and unsecured loans. As executor, I am required to settle those debts first. The contents of that account will be entirely consumed by payments to American Express, his tailor, and a certain jeweler in the Diamond District who, it seems, specialized in exceptionally high-quality replicas." He let that last statement hang in the air. Scarlett instinctively looked down at the massive diamond on her finger. Her face, already pale, turned a ghostly white. The rock on her hand, her ultimate symbol of victory, was a fake. A lie, just like everything else. The laughter from the funeral, that sound of raw, hysterical triumph, now seemed like a pathetic, distant echo. The thread of her victory had not just unraveled, it had been revealed to be rotten from the start. Catherine watched not with pleasure, but with a kind of weary recognition. This was Richard's final, cruelest trick. He had given his mistress everything she'd ever wanted, but he'd made it all worthless. He had promised her a kingdom and handed her a pile of dust and debt. He had managed to control and punish her even from the grave. "This is ridiculous!" Scarlett finally exploded, standing up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "He loved me. He wouldn't do this to me. You're lying. This is some trick." She turned on Catherine, her eyes wild with fury and desperation. "This is your doing. You poisoned him against me." Ms. Vance, I must insist you sit down, Finch said, his voice rising in authority for the first time. I am not finished. I don't care if you're finished, Scarlett shrieked, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. He told me I was his future. He wouldn't leave me with a mountain of debt and a fake ring. This will is a fraud. Her lawyer, looking utterly defeated, tugged on her sleeve. Scarlett, please, let the man speak. There is more, Margaret Davies asked, her voice sharp. She had watched Scarlett's humiliation with cold satisfaction, but the news of her son's financial ruin had clearly shaken her. The family name was now attached to a bankrupt enterprise. Indeed, Alistair Finch said. He reached inside the leather-bound folder and extracted a separate, smaller envelope sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Davies family crest. This is a codicil to the will. It was executed 3 months ago and delivered to me by Mr. Davies personally, with instructions that it was to be opened only after the primary will had been read in its entirety. He cracked the seal with a neat flick of his thumb, the sound snapping through the tense room. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. This codicil, he announced, amends and supersedes certain clauses of the main testament. Scarlett froze, a desperate, wild hope dawning in her eyes. See? He changed it. He fixed it for me. Finch ignored her. He began to read. Codicil to the last will and testament of Richard Harold Davies, dated July 14th, 2025. His eyes scanned the room before continuing. Let this document clarify my intentions, free from the performance required in my primary will. The bequests made in that document to Ms. Scarlett Vance were a transaction of final payment for services rendered. The debts attached to those gifts are a lesson in the true cost of things. Scarlett let out a strangled gasp, as if she'd been physically struck. Finch continued reading Richard's cold, posthumous words. The Davies Holdings Company is, as my partner David knows, a shell game. I played it well for a long time. It is now a husk. I leave its fate to the board I have named. Let them fight over the bones. Margaret Davies closed her eyes, her face a mask of grim resignation. The public humiliation she had feared for the family name was now a certainty. My true legacy. Finch read his voice, taking on a slightly different cadence, as if the tone of the writing itself had shifted, is not in buildings or bank accounts accessible to creditors. It is secured elsewhere, and its stewardship falls to the only person I ever truly misjudged. Every eye in the room turned to Catherine. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play about her own life. Finch cleared his throat. The clause in my will regarding my wife, Catherine Marie Davies, is hereby struck. The provision of the Greenwich House and the insulting stipend are null and void. Scarlett stared, her mind unable to process this new turn. Was Catherine being thrown out with nothing in its place? Finch read the final paragraphs of Richard's last words. I declare the following to be the truth. 15 years ago, on the advice of my father's financial planners, I established an independent offshore trust to shield my core assets from the volatility of my business dealings. It was called the Kensington Trust. To legally separate it from my own name and protect it from any future litigation or bankruptcy proceedings, it had to be placed in another's name. I chose my wife, Catherine. Catherine's breath hitched. She remembered it now. A mountain of paperwork 15 years ago. Richard had called it estate planning, something to do with taxes. He had been charming patient, guiding her hand as she signed page after page, never explaining, just smiling, his reassuring, controlling smile. "It's just a formality, darling." "The Kensington Trust," Finch continued reading, "was seeded with my entire personal fortune at the time. Every subsequent dividend from my profitable ventures, every bonus, every cent that was not immediately funneled back into the precarious shell game of Davies Holdings was deposited into that trust. The trust's assets were managed by a discreet firm in Switzerland, and as per the articles of its creation articles, my wife signed the sole beneficiary and controller of the trust, with absolute and irrevocable power, is its namesake. Catherine Marie Davies. The room was utterly deathly silent. "I did this believing I would always control her, and by extension the trust," Richard's statement concluded. "I saw her quietness as weakness, her dignity as passivity. I was wrong. It was strength. She is the only part of my life I did not manage to corrupt or ruin. The assets of the Kensington Trust are not part of my estate. They are not subject to my debts. They are and always have been, legally and completely hers. As of my death, the Swiss firm will report only to her. The estimated value of the Trust's assets as of the 1st of this month is $357 million. The number hung in the air, an impossible gravitational weight. $357 million. Olivia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David Chen stared at Catherine with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. Margaret Davies's jaw was slack, her icy composure finally shattered. And Scarlett Vance simply collapsed into her chair, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and horror. The penthouse, the company, the fake diamond. It was all dust, scraps from the table. The entire time she had been playing for the kingdom, she hadn't realized that the quiet, invisible woman across the table already owned the entire world. Alistair Finch neatly folded the codicil and placed it on the table. He looked at Catherine, and for the first time, a glimmer of something human, something like respect, appeared in his lawyerly eyes. "Congratulations, Mrs. Davies," he said softly. "It would appear you have inherited everything that was real." The aftermath was not an explosion, but a slow, silent collapse. Scarlett Vance did not scream or rage. All the fire, all the audacious energy seemed to have been sucked out of her, leaving a hollow shell. She stared blankly at Catherine, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the reality of the last 5 minutes with the victorious narrative she had lived in for the last 5 years. Her young lawyer, pale and shaken, helped her to her feet. She walked out of this conference room like a zombie, her defiant click-clack heels now a stumbling, uncertain shuffle. The doors swung shut behind her, sealing off the end of her story. Margaret Davies was the next to stir. She rose from her chair with a pained stiffness every one of her years, suddenly visible on her face. She looked at Catherine, her expression a complex mixture of shock, resentment, and a strange, grudging deference. The power in the family had shifted irrevocably. The woman she had always viewed as a decorative but inconsequential daughter-in-law was now the matriarch. "Catherine." Margaret said the name sounding foreign on her lips. She seemed to want to say more, perhaps to extend an olive branch or make a demand, but the words wouldn't come. She simply gave a short, jerky nod and swept out of the room, her pride, the only thing she had left. David Chen remained. He walked over to Catherine, his face etched with a weary relief. "He was a brilliant monster, wasn't he?" David said quietly, shaking his head. "He built a labyrinth and left everyone to die in it, but you. I'm glad it was you, Catherine, for what it's worth." "Thank you, David," she replied, her voice steady, though her mind was still reeling. If you want to use some of your capital to salvage the company, to save the employees' jobs. He started, then stopped himself. I'm sorry. That's not my place. It's your decision now. All of it. He gave her a small, respectful bow and departed, leaving Catherine alone with Olivia and Alistair Finch. The lawyer began stacking his papers into a neat pile. The Swiss firm Zurich Sterling Partners will be expecting your call. They have been managing the trust for 15 years. They are exceptionally discreet. Here is the direct contact information for your portfolio manager, Mr. Brandt. He slid a card across the table. You are an exceptionally wealthy woman, Mrs. Davies. You will require a new team of financial and legal advisors. My firm would be honored to— No, thank you, Mr. Finch, Catherine said, the words coming to her with surprising clarity. I think I'll be starting completely fresh. Finch nodded, unfazed. As you wish. My duties as executor of Richard's other estate will continue. It will be a messy affair untangling the debts. As Catherine and Olivia stood to leave, Finch spoke one last time. Mrs. Davies. For what it's worth, I knew Richard's father. He always said his son's greatest flaw was that he could never recognize true value. He was right. Walking out of the building and into the bright New York City afternoon felt like stepping into a different world. The city noise, the blur of taxis, the rush of people, it all seemed new, vibrant. Olivia hugged her tightly. Kate, I have no words. Are you okay? Catherine looked up at the sky, a brilliant, clear blue. I think I will be, she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in years. I think I finally will be. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vengeful. The money was staggering, almost abstract, but it wasn't the source of the lightness she felt in her soul. The money wasn't the victory. The truth was the victory. The knowledge that her quiet endurance had not been foolishness. Her dignity, which Richard had mistaken for weakness, had been her shield. He had tried to imprison her in a gilded cage, but all along she had held the key. He just never thought she would know how to use it. They hailed a cab, but Catherine didn't give the driver the address for the Greenwich mansion. That was a mausoleum of a life that was no longer hers. Take us to the West Village, please, she said, near the art galleries. As the cab pulled into traffic, Olivia looked at her, a question in her eyes. What are you going to do now, Kate? Catherine thought for a moment, watching the city flash by. She thought of the smell of oil paints and turpentine, of the feel of a fresh canvas, of the woman she had been before Richard Davies had acquired her. I think, she said, her voice filled with a quiet, thrilling sense of possibility, I'm going to buy a small gallery, and then I'm going to get my hands very, very dirty. The wealth wasn't a prize. It was a tool. It was the freedom she had been denied for 2 decades. The freedom to create, to build something of her own, to live a life that wasn't a reflection of a powerful man, but was entirely, unapologetically hers. The sun streamed through the window of the cab, and for the first time, Catherine felt its warmth not just on her skin, but deep within her bones. It was the dawn of a different, better day. 6 months later, the scent of lilies and old money was a distant memory, replaced by the smell of plaster dust, old wood, and the promise of fresh paint. Catherine stood in the middle of a cavernous, sun-drenched space in the West Village. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling front windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny dancing diamonds. The walls were scarred from decades of previous tenants, the hardwood floors scuffed and worn. To anyone else, it was a wreck. To Catherine, it was the most beautiful room in the world. She was not the woman who had sat in Alistair Finch's office. The designer morning dress was long gone, replaced by worn jeans, a simple white linen shirt, and practical boots. There was a smudge of dust on her cheek, and her hair was tied back in a simple, unstudied knot. She was no longer Mrs. Richard Davies, a carefully curated appendage to a powerful man. She was just Catherine. Earlier that morning, while grabbing a coffee, her eyes had snagged on a tabloid headline at a newsstand. A grainy photo of Scarlett Vance looking haggard and thin was splashed across the front page. From penthouse to eviction notice, Richard Davies's mistress loses it all. The article detailed how she had been forced into bankruptcy, hounded by the creditors of the company she had briefly helped oversee, and was now selling off her possessions to pay legal fees. The replica diamond ring had reportedly fetched less than $1,000 at a pawn shop. Catherine had felt a brief, surprising pang of something that wasn't triumph, but a weary pity. Scarlett had been just another one of Richard's acquisitions, and like all the others, she had been disposable. "It's got good bones, but it needs a lot of work," the real estate agent said, tapping a wall skeptically. "We could probably get the seller to come down another 10%. And Catherine ran her hand along a rough brick wall, feeling the history under her fingertips. "No, the price is fine," she said, her voice clear and decisive. "I'll take it, and I'll pay in cash. Please have the papers drawn up by the end of the day." The agent's jaw dropped. He had been trying to sell this dilapidated space for a year. Catherine turned a slow smile touching her lips as she surveyed her new domain. She envisioned it all: the walls pristine white, the floors sanded and polished to a warm glow, track lighting perfectly angled to illuminate the bold, vibrant canvases she would hang. She wouldn't be showing established masters or chasing the artists Richard had once collected as investments. Her gallery, the Davies Gallery. She would keep the name, but on her own terms now would be a haven for the unknown, the brilliant, the struggling. It would be a place for people who, like the old Catherine, had a voice, but had never been given a room in which to use it. The money, that ridiculous, impossible number, no longer felt like Richard's. He had created the trust as another form of control, a secret vault he could command through her. He had miscalculated. His final convoluted act wasn't a gift or an apology. It was simply a mistake. His motives had died with him, and Catherine felt no need to analyze them. The only thing that mattered was the here and now. The money was a tool, and for the first time in her life, she was the one holding it. Standing in the center of the empty room, bathed in the afternoon light, Catherine felt the last phantom weight of her old life lift from her shoulders. This was her blank canvas, and she couldn't wait to begin. Catherine's story is a powerful reminder that dignity is not weakness, and the quietest person in the room often holds the most power. It's a tale of betrayal, but also one of unexpected vindication, and the strength it takes to reclaim your own life from the ashes of another's lies. The true inheritance wasn't the money. It was the freedom to finally be herself. What would you have done in her position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of justice served cold, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a good tale of twists and turns, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update on the intricate dramas that remind us truth is always the most valuable asset.